wherever you are in the world, whatever time zone you're in. Great to have you on board. Don't forget you can interact with us. I say us, you'll find out who our other guest is in a second, on YouTube chat with comments, observations. Try and keep it clean and nice. I think that would be appropriate, wouldn't it? But anyway, welcome, as I say, on this Wednesday before the Miami Grand Prix weekend, which is a sprint weekend. We've had them before, notably last year when I think most of us will remember, probably forever, Charles going off on the formation lap, or the out lap, I think it was, wasn't it, in the wet. But then the track dried very quickly. That was one significant thing I thought about that sprint race. Anyway, we'll get onto the subject potentially of weather and so forth in Miami in a second. But before I go any further, I would like to introduce, and I'm introducing him with, as you can see, a very nice message from Jim Huntz, who's donated $10 there as a super chat. Thank you very much for that nice comment, Jim. And it's a great pleasure to introduce yet again my friend and colleague, Mark Slade. Mark, welcome to the show. I think you're just back from a trip, actually, Scotland, I think, significant motor racing wise.
Hello, Peter. I am back from a trip, but not motor racing related. I just went back to my hometown where I grew up. I'm obviously not Scottish, you can tell from my accent, but my dad was a helicopter pilot, so that's where I grew up. Yeah.
What in what sphere was he? Was he commercial? Was he military?
He started in the RAF flying Vulcan bombers.
You don't meet many people these days whose throwaway line is, "Oh well, he started off flying Vulcan bombers." I mean, tell us more. The most significant bomber probably of all time. I always have to say, when the odd occasion they have been used, I've always felt so sorry for the people on the ground below them. The shadow of that thing approaching must be absolutely frightening. They're just huge, aren't they, in their real form?
And the howl of the engine, very distinctive engine note, although obviously for altitude bombing, they probably wouldn't have heard them. But he joined the RAF when he was 16, I think, and he was the youngest flying officer in the RAF in Bomber Command in 1963 when he got his wings, and he joined 617 Squadron as a pilot. Yeah, but he actually, whilst he enjoyed that time to some extent, he said that he used to sit in the cockpit of the one of those planes for 8 hours a day and dispersal. Those were the days of was it the 7-minute warning or whatever, and that's what they spent most of their time doing. And I'm afraid he found that wasn't what he wanted out of being in the RAF. He wanted to actually fly. So, and also he found flying fixed wings actually relatively straightforward. So he decided that helicopters were a much more satisfying form of transport to fly in the end. But I mean, he was very determined. Came from a very poor background in Croydon in London, and worked his way through. My mum always used to say when she used to go to mess dinners, my dad used to have quite a strong South London accent, and all the other guys were quite posh, so he did stick out like a bit of a sore thumb as the scally in the room.
Being the guy he was, or you just described, I imagine he loved it when you were at McLaren running Mika and Kimi.
He was a fan of racing when he was younger. Jim Clark was actually his hero. And Sterling Moss, and I remember very proudly when I was still, I think I was at Reynard's. He was proud that he flew David Coulthard out to one of the oil rigs because I think David was driving for Williams and they had some sort of oil sponsor connection, and Dad flew him out in one of the helicopters. So had his photo taken. He was very, very proud of that day and telling me about it. And the other slightly bizarre thing was there was a pilot at British Airways helicopters back in the early 80s, or late 80s, early 90s. He was a guy from New Zealand, and my dad said, "Oh yeah, I got chatting to this guy. He's a very quiet guy, but he said he used to race cars a bit." And I said, "Oh, what did you do?" And he said, "Yeah, he was European Formula 2 champion one year, and it was Mike Thackwell." And he actually flew for British Airways helicopters for about a year before he went off and did something else. But my dad said he actually wasn't that great a pilot.
Did DC ever know that about your dad doing that?
I remember mentioning it to him once we were at McLaren and DC was there. I did say, yeah. I mean, he remembered the trip, but obviously he didn't remember my dad. But he was, yeah. It's funny, those little things that can happen, though, isn't it? Small world.
It is a small world. Anyway, just to annoy you and to annoy everybody, I'm now going to show some pictures from Monaco Classic. You mentioned Jim Clark. There's Mark Shaw's Lotus 21. Beautiful car, space frame chassis, of course. 61 Formula One car. And with that chassis, Jim dominated the 61, 62 Springbok series in South Africa. Trevor Taylor won some races too, his teammate in the other car. And Mark's been really quick in that car. And I think he was qualified on the front row, but then got done for track limits or something going through the swimming pool section. How ridiculous. Here's a picture of the Ferraris. Look at that. I don't know if you can see these, Mark. Can you see these pictures? No, you can't. Sorry. There's 3 Ferraris from 3 different eras. Like 68, 69, and maybe another 69er in the back there, just under an awning at Monaco. And this is a very, very short video. All these pictures and video are courtesy of Horatio Fitzsimon, who we met in the last live stream, actually, who went to Monaco with his racing kit. I don't think he got a drive in the end, but he hung out and did a lot of talking with sponsors and hospitality and stuff. And anyway, he did this very, very short video of the start of the race, the main Formula One race. This is just to annoy everybody and so that you can hear what Formula One cars used to sound. Great camera work there by Horatio to get those opposite lock moments. A beautiful McLaren M23 Gordon Coppett car. Lovely to see that. Anyway, there's lots of noise. What's that Formula One noise? DFVs, Cosworths. Not allowed to make a noise anymore. Anyway, being a little bit facetious now. Mark, let's just get your thoughts about Miami. We've had a little bit of time for the new mods to the regs to settle into the brains of us, of our collective Formula One fans. And we've had your input, which has been great. But I wonder if you had any more thoughts leading specifically into this race now about how things might pan out.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how Mercedes competitiveness, or the Mercedes engine car's competitiveness, ranks against the others, given that they probably had the most to lose by the energy regulations being relaxed, shall we say, in terms of the drivers not having to do as much recovery. So Mercedes' advantage will have been reduced somewhat. I suspect at this track, it probably won't make a huge amount of difference because I don't think this is as much of a limited track as certainly as we saw in Suzuka and even more so in Melbourne. I think it's going to be good news in terms of the onboards and seeing the cars. I think the drivers are going to be able to drive the cars much more on the limit on corner entries. So that's just good news, I think. I think it's actually been, I think it's quite a decent step that they have made. There was some information that came out, some simulation comparisons that were done between how Melbourne was and how it would be under the current regs, courtesy of McLaren. And it made quite a big difference in Melbourne. And bearing in mind that Melbourne's one of the worst tracks of the year for the energy recovery, if it's made a big difference in Melbourne, it's probably going to mostly, cure most of the downsides that we've seen at other tracks so far this year. So I'm hopeful about that. But really, it's also going to come down to which teams have been able to upgrade their cars in the off season, or call it the off season, the period that we've had since the last race. I think the thing to bear in mind is that any improvements that the teams have been able to make are mostly going to be things that they already had in the works, because this period of inactivity, that's likely to give a benefit to the teams later in the season, because they'll have had time to do more work on modeling, simulation and development that they would have spent the time actually doing racing instead and being prepared for racing. So in terms of whether this period gives us big improvements itself, I don't think it will. It's just a question of there being a period where new developments will be coming through that were already planned. And we might see that later in the year there's some extra steps that people make that they've been able to because of the time they've been focusing on that rather than on just week-to-week running of the cars. My feeling is, I think on this sort of circuit, the Mercedes engine cars and Mercedes as a team, possibly also McLaren, will have a little bit less of an advantage in terms of car balance, because the circuit doesn't have many medium speed corners, it's more low speed. And I think other cars might catch up in that respect. I'm sort of thinking that maybe Ferrari, particularly Charles, might have a stronger weekend. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking Oscar. We haven't seen much of Oscar's capabilities so far this year because of the unfortunate circumstances of the races we've had so far. And his performance in Japan was phenomenal, but a very different circuit. Well, we'll see how he gets on. So overall, I'm just expecting the field to be a bit more closed up, maybe.
Just to go back to your point about there'll be probably no upgrades in Miami as a result of the break we've just had. What you're saying is, in order to have had an upgrade for Miami, they would have had to have committed to that when before the Australian Grand Prix even?
So ideas come up over a period of time. The cost benefit analysis, which has to be done these days because of the cost cap, will have been done, and certain projects will have been greenlit. And obviously it takes an amount of time to put those into action because the parts have to be researched and then designed and then manufactured, and depending on how long lead an item they will be, it takes a certain amount of time for these to come through. So given that we've had is it a 4 or 5 week period, I would say that's probably not quite enough for most projects to come to fruition. So I would have thought pretty much everything that you see coming through will have been something that was thought about, certainly whilst the first few races were taking place, if not before that. There might be 1 or 2 simple aero things that people have been able to add in and push through. But I think really people will have used the time to look at the data, assess their performances compared to other teams, analyze their weaknesses and put thought into where they think they can address those. And those ideas and projects will come to fruition over the next sort of, say, 2 months to 3 month period, most likely.
Yeah, and McLaren already saying new brake ducts, floor, various bits and bobs. I mean, potentially, I suppose you could have started to rush things through a little bit in April by saying, wow, look what Mercedes have got on their diffuser. We'll put that in the pipeline. Oh, no, we got this brake now. We'll rush that through. We'll just basically put it in the tunnel, do whatever quickly. We want to make this now. Let's get it going. We've got this opportunity. Would there have been any thinking like that, do you imagine?
I'm sure there would have been some, but that's quite a tricky thing to do. In a 5 week period is quite short scale, really, for major developments. And brake ducts are actually some of the more complicated parts to design.
I was thinking more floor than brake ducts.
Yeah.
Actually.
Oh, the floor, I would say, is definitely one of the areas where that could well have happened. And if we see some little aero sort of trinkets on front wing end plates. That sort of thing may be a result of seeing what's happened in the first 3. Well, we've had 4 races, and then people have started to adapt to that. But it just takes a little bit of time, and everything has to be blended in. So it's not always super quick.
And neither of us, of course, know the answer to this question. I'm sure. Well, I'm sure. I mean, I certainly don't. But I wonder whether this hiatus has helped the Aston Martin Honda situation, in that it's been a bit quieter, things more settled, they're not traveling, maybe they've got a bit more focus, they can get on top of what those issues are with the battery.
Yeah, I suspect that's probably, I would hope that's one of the biggest benefits for any of the teams would be for Honda and Aston in terms of dealing with those deep-rooted issues that they've got without that constant battle just to get cars to the track and running, because that is a huge drain on resources. So if anyone's benefited from this period, I would have thought it would be them to some extent, probably more than anybody else, because it will have given them a breathing space. I'm sure they came out of pre-season testing and certainly Melbourne with a good understanding of where they had problems, and enacting solutions to those will definitely have been helped by having a big gap. So it'll be interesting to see how they've made use of that.
Mark, 2 races to go for Mercedes in terms of their compression ratio before we get to Monaco, when they can no longer run their system. But we shouldn't forget that Ferrari may be impacted by that as well. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Ferrari have these steel cylinder heads, and when the issue of the Mercedes compression ratio was brought up, I thought, well, maybe part of the reason they went down that route at Ferrari was to try and get a small benefit from differential expansion of materials. So I think they touted it as being mainly a sort of rigidity benefit, which it will be as well. But I think they might be getting some small compression ratio benefit from that. But obviously, if that's a measurable amount, they will also have to react to that, and they may have to be doing some work to bring their compression ratios into alignment with the new rules after the next two races. But ultimately, I think whatever benefit they are getting from that, even if they are, it would be small, even if the sum. I think it's fair to say that Mercedes will be penalised relatively more than Ferrari, and I suppose you could argue it might mean that Honda and Ford. Well, we think that the Red Bull might also have something, don't we? So I guess that they're going to have to take action as well. So yeah, we'll see a realignment, but it might be that Ferrari aren't scot-free and that they're actually having to do some work as well.
Thoughts in general on this Miami weekend, Mark, bearing in mind it's a sprint race, and Miami, the challenges of Miami, the characteristics of it, the paddock layout, the pit lane. You've talked a little bit about the circuit layout. We know that Pirelli are bringing softest tyres in the range, no surprise there.
It's a funny event. The paddock is sort of split into two areas. So you've got the pit lane outside the stadium, obviously next to the track, but the actual sort of hospitality and team offices are actually on the pitch of the stadium itself. So the distance between the two is quite big. So there's always a bit of a walk between one place and the other. And if you forget something in one place, you've got a long way to go back to get it. I seem to remember to my cost. It's generally sunny, lots of people around, good atmosphere. In terms of the track, I wouldn't say from my point of view it was particularly memorable. It's not what I would call a great racetrack. It's a largely street style circuit. The curbs are of some impact. There's one place where there's quite some high speed curbs that were difficult to manage back in 23 and 24. Although with these cars being a bit softer, I think that will be less of an issue. We had bit of problems with bouncing there, but obviously again with the non-ground effect cars that we've got now, that will be less of a problem. But fundamentally, it's low speed corners, relatively low speed corners. Getting the car rotated is the important thing, and then getting on the power. So I just think Mercedes and McLaren's sort of medium speed corner benefit, which I think they have, will be a bit less of an issue. And the Red Bull, which I feel has kind of struggled in higher speed corners, obviously with less of them as well. It might be that the Red Bull is a little bit more competitive just because those corners aren't there. I know we can always rely on Max to sort of try and perform wonders with his car. But we also sort of seen that the traction of the Red Bull doesn't seem that fantastic. And obviously out of low speed corners, that might be a problem. But if they're able to concentrate the balance in one type of area, so one type of corner, they might be able to get more out of the car than they have been overall so far. I mean, the last race was obviously disastrous for Red Bull, wasn't it? But then it's a track that does highlight car imbalance. So I think, whereas this one will be less of that. So I think overall we'll just see a compressing of the field. And if someone does a particularly good lap in quali, we might see some slight surprises on the grids for the sprint and the main race.
One of the things that we haven't talked much about, I don't think anybody's talked much about it really, is the top speeds. And I can't remember a Formula One era in which there's been no chat about, oh, they're really quick in a straight line, which what we used to mean by that was they're really quick aerodynamically in a straight line, which probably meant that they didn't have enough downforce on the rest of the lap. But, a couple of years ago, we always used to say, well, the Ferraris are really good in a straight line, but, medium speed. That's all gone away now, really, isn't it? Or do you have a feel in your mind as to who's actually quick in a straight line? And maybe, given the changes we've had with the engines now, we might see some differences in top speed on the long straights in Miami?
The Mercedes car has been particularly quick I think the problem is that those speeds are achieved much earlier on the straights than they used to be. So the traditional speed trap positions, which are sort of just before braking on the longest straight, because of the way the cars actually slow down on the straights, those speeds are not particularly representative, and the peak speeds are much earlier. And one of the Mercedes advantages this year has been achieving higher speeds, largely, I think, because their energy recovery is superior, so they can expend more energy coming out of corners and therefore achieve the higher speeds. But as you say, it's kind of not obvious unless you've actually got the track data in front of you where that's happening. I think now that is why Mercedes' advantage is going to be reduced, because the effect of the changes that we see are that they're not going to have as much of an advantage in that extra energy coming out of corners. And so the speed differential earlier on the straights won't be as big. So they're just not going to gain. I don't think they'll gain quite as much on the straights as they were previously. But I think it comes down to how Formula One sort of shows differences in car performance to the fans, the spectators. I think they could be doing a better job to explain these things, really, because it's only when you look at the actual track data that you get an appreciation for where things are happening. And the fact is, these cars have achieved terrifically high speeds compared to the previous generation of cars. But as I say, it happens earlier on the straight and no one's talking about it. But obviously, and the effect of these rules is that those high speeds will be somewhat reduced now.
Okay, I'm still a bit confused though. Are we saying that they'll all be reaching their own personal terminal velocity even sooner now with these new regs? And if that is the case, does that mean that a car which has a more aerodynamically efficient setup for the straight will now have more of an advantage than it had before? I know it's quite a complex question. If you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah, so
I'm interested in the aero side of top speed.
Yeah. No, if anything, a more efficient car was more beneficial when the energy recovery was harder. So what?
When you say more efficient, you mean more efficient aerodynamically?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So when it was more difficult to recover energy, as it was in the first 4 races, an aerodynamic efficiency benefit was better for you than it will be now, because there's less need to recover energy. That efficiency benefit will be slightly reduced. You'll still get a benefit, but the impact of it will be slightly less. The cars are reaching much higher speeds than they used to earlier on the straights because their acceleration is so much quicker, because with the electric power, the cars have more power for the initial acceleration than they had in the previous generation. But because of the fuel flow and then the fact that the allowed electrical energy is reduced as the car speed increases, the cars actually have less and less power as they go down the straight above, I'm trying to remember now, it's above about 290 kilometers an hour. The amount of power is reducing. So the cars slow down regardless of any energy recovery. That's not super clipping, that's not lift and coast. That's just that the rules say the cars have to have less power, less electrical power above 290 k. So by the end of a straight where they're achieving 320 kph, there's actually no electrical power for a car in standard form. So effectively, that's a car running 530 horsepower, whereas last year the cars had significantly more of that at the end of the straight. So they were quicker end of straight, but the speeds achieved earlier on the straight with these cars are higher than the speeds that the old cars achieved at end of straight. And that's because of having less drag, because they've got less downforce, because the cars inherently have less drag because the tyres are a bit narrower as well, and they have much more initial acceleration power.
Yeah, I get the point about the initial acceleration, but when they get to that point where they're only on ICE power, as you said, 500 horsepower, and they can't take any more power through the electrics, isn't that then the moment when a car that is more aerodynamically efficient is going to be able to show its worth? Isn't that when, if say the Mercedes is 3% more aerodynamically efficient than the McLaren. Isn't that where the Mercedes is going to have a big advantage now?
It will have an advantage, but most lap time benefit comes under acceleration up to a speed. That's the time you gain the most time. So end of straight speed is beneficial, but a small difference in end of straight speed between two cars doesn't give you a huge amount of lap time.
Okay, but I've got to stop you there, though. This is exactly the point that I don't understand. Surely now that end of straight speed is arrived at sooner, and there's a longer period now, which can be defined as the end of straight speed. That's what I'm trying to say. That section of the lap is now longer, so therefore the aerodynamics are going to be more significant. Or am I wrong? Is it not going to be longer?
I think, without having seen the simulations, I think the fact is that, yes, a more aerodynamically efficient car will gain a small amount for a slightly longer period, but I suspect that the fact that tying it into the engine power, engine recovery, the advantage that gave in a car, it's all about balances, and my suspicion is that the benefit of the better recovery and the more energy recovery of a better engine drivetrain combined with better aerodynamics was a greater advantage than the simple benefit of reduced drag when both cars are limited on speed. Is my assumption.
Yeah, okay. Right.
Without actually having the calculations and the simulations in front of me, I may be wrong, but knowing that most lap time comes from being able to accelerate more quickly up to a speed, that's why I think that the balance has shifted slightly, and that it's more about the engine performance reduction than it is about the aero. But I mean, maybe the Mercedes wasn't actually an aerodynamically more efficient car. It just had a better drivetrain and more power, and that's how it achieved higher straight line speeds. Is difficult to know.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I would say is that the fact that the cars have less power now means that the design targets that the teams work to in designing these cars in terms of how much base downforce to provide will have been adjusted slightly. Whether it's significant enough that they should actually now be running slightly different rear wings, I'm not sure. But it's all interrelated. It's all very complicated, as the design should be. But these are the sorts of things that the teams are going to be thinking about. I would be interested to know whether this change has been enough for any of the teams to think, oh, we now need to design a different rear wing because we've got less energy recovery, we'll have less power on the straights, we might need to have slightly less downforce overall to rebalance that. It's possible, but I suspect the amount they're talking about, and it might have been one of the factors in why they came to the amount of power reduction they did, was that was the most they could do without needing to redesign rear wings and costing a load of money. I think these things may have been part of that design process.
Phew, it's complicated, isn't it? It really is complicated. And the layers that one can peel off the onion are almost infinite, really, in terms of one thing affecting another. And is that a good thing again for the fans? I mean, they just want to see motor racing. Look at that start we just saw from Monaco Classic, but anyway, it is what it is. Let me ask you this, Mark. Why is Miami so easy on tires? It's a one-stop race generally, softest compounds. What's that all about?
It's basically because it's a low grip surface. It doesn't get any other racing use. US tracks generally have lower grip anyway. Whether they've used, so it's changed a bit now because sometimes the tarmac used on US tracks, I think, has been imported from Europe occasionally. I think that was true. It might even be true of Miami, but certainly old days, the track grips were generally lower. But it's the fact it's a circuit without any high-speed corners, because it's the high-speed corners that do the damage to tyres. And so with a relatively low amount of high-speed corners, and the fact that track grip is low in itself, it means you can get away with the softer tyre. It's like Monaco. There's just not. Monaco is the extreme case because the race isn't even the same length as a standard race. So that means that the tyres get an even easier time in Monaco than everywhere else. But it is just that basically high-speed corners are the ones that do damage, and then a rough circuit at high speed does extra damage on top of that.
Okay, get that one. And what is the impact of it being a sprint weekend with these reg changes and it being a street race of this type? What would it be like if you were an engineer now facing all those different variables?
It just means that you have less time to fine tune the car over the course of the weekend. So the car you put on the track on Friday morning, I would say you probably take a little bit more risk with ride height to get the car a bit lower to try to find out what your lower limit actually is. Because although these cars are less sensitive to ride height than the ground effect previous generation, it's still important. So you just tend to try to push things a little bit harder, knowing that you need to find answers sooner rather than later. And that puts an emphasis on drivers as well, because the drivers have to be capable of telling you quickly whether they've got a problem with what you've done and whether they can react to it quickly enough and give you the right feedback. So it does put an emphasis on the good working relationship between the drivers and the engineers coming up with car setups that are closer to spot on maybe than normal. So you go into sprint qualifying on Friday afternoon, you've had one chance between the end of practice and qualifying to adjust the car, and then that's it. You can't change the car till the end of the sprint race itself. What's different as of, I think it was 2 years ago, was that they actually allow changes between the sprint race and full qualifying, whereas in the first few years of the sprint races that you weren't even allowed to do that, and so you were stuck with whatever setup you had, which was that made life particularly difficult. So yeah, it's all about trying to get to the best setup quicker, and that really puts an emphasis on driver experience as well as and the engineer's understanding of what that driver is capable of. And I think it's probably better for the older guys to some extent, because they're just more tuned in. Although with this new generation of cars, I suppose that's a bit of a leveler to some extent.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Interesting, in the Pirelli press release, they quaintly used the word or phrase, important to avoid neutralizations. What's that mean? Getting neutral with the gearbox. What they mean is going off and damaging the car and neutralizing your effort.
What a great euphemism.
Yeah, I can imagine the driver coming in, I've neutralized the right front. Sorry about that.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other thing, Mark, before we go to some questions and comments. Interesting news this morning that the UAE, United Arab Emirates, have withdrawn from OPEC.
Yeah.
And that will have an effect on Saudi Arabia and Aramco and the way they go forward, I would suspect.
It's very interesting, isn't it? There's clearly quite some big problems, obviously, between the members of that organisation, and the UAE are trying to stamp their authority on things. One thing I was thinking is it because of a sustainable future, maybe a future with less requirement for oil, and the UAE want to use up their reserves quicker and actually cash in early in case they get left with a product that people don't want in the future. That might be one thing. But the other thing it just makes you think is it a lever in some dispute that they've got with Saudi Arabia? Is it a negotiation tool? It certainly gives them a lot of power, doesn't it?
Well, it gives them,
a very interesting
gives them
thing.
control of the price of oil, basically, which is a big thing.
I think it's huge, and I thought it was interesting how I got the impression that the news organisations that covered it yesterday and this morning, I don't think they realised the impact that it could have. But we shall see.
Yeah. I mean, Aramco all over the Miami Grand Prix. Indeed, they are over Formula One in general, Aston Martin as well.
Yeah.
Right, let's get some questions going. Thank you very much to Jim for having that nice little subhead we've had throughout this chat. But moving on now, we've got Sarosh, who's a member. Thank you very much indeed, Sarosh, for your support. Hi, Peter, Mark. Continuing the discussion on fingertip driving, which is something that I actually talked about, you probably know what that's all about, Mark, but I was just talking about how it is individual for everybody, steering loads, etc. Obviously, all the variables, but the great drivers tend to be very supple and soft in everything they do, and that, you know, obviously applies to the feeling they're getting through the steering and indeed other parts of their body. They just need to keep everything soft. Supple is the right word, I think. James Allison said that Kimi Räikkönen needed a steering that's light and precise. Mark, any additional feedback on how Kimi wanted to set up his car?
So the thing, he absolutely did need excellent feeling from the steering. It didn't translate into a setup thing as much as just the system, getting the system working correctly. And at the teams he was at, we always had more issues on Kimi's car with him complaining about the system being out of balance in terms of the assistance between left and right, or the steering wheel not being perfectly straight, or having any deadband in the steering. The other drivers would accommodate a variation in left to right assistance that he absolutely would not. And we actually went through a phase in the Lotus days, so 2012, 13, where we were having to rebalance the systems that came from the factory. We were actually having to rebalance them on the car on the Thursday before the car ran, to his satisfaction, because it was something that was being affected. But for instance, if you got a little bit of friction from a carbon shroud on the steering arm, that would affect it, and he would want that corrected. So yeah, he absolutely was. He did want very, very, very precise, balanced power steering assistance. Beyond that, in terms of car setup, I don't think, as long as you got the wheels pointing in the right direction and the steering wheel straight.
If I can just say, Sarash's next question, he says, I understand he always wanted the decent front end, and then he managed everything else around it in terms of that being the baseline. Is that what it was like with Kimi?
No, I don't think that's the case. That was more, for me, a Michael Schumacher type, and maybe even a Max Verstappen type situation. Whereas for Kimi, he wanted the car to be neutral. He didn't want a pinned front end and he would deal with the rear of the car. He wanted that perfect balance, really. And obviously that's difficult to achieve. So he didn't like having a bit too much understeer mid-corner, but at the same time, he didn't want the rear of the car loose under braking. So, for instance, we used to run a very, very low level of engine braking. We would pretty much have the amount of engine braking set at the minimum, so that as he downshifted, the variation in engine braking, because obviously when you engage a shorter gear, you get suddenly more torque and more engine braking. So we would actually have the throttle open, effectively reducing the amount of engine braking so that he got a smooth progression. That meant he had to press the brake pedal harder to stop the car more, as quickly, but he would rather do that than have the back end of the car disturbed by a variation in engine braking. Whereas, for instance, Pablo Montoya, he used to run the ABS systems that were allowed back in sort of 2005. He used to run a much more aggressive setting, and he would happily deal with the rear variation in under rotation and the rear sort of moving around under braking. He just wanted the car to be pinned at the front, or sorry, not pinned, but he would want the car to slow down very quickly. Whereas Kimi would not like that feeling at all and wanted to basically be in control himself. I think that's the difference, is Kimi wanted to be in control. He wanted to know what the car was going to do next, whereas someone like Montoya seemed to prefer to react to what the car was doing live. Kimi didn't want to do that. He wanted to know what the car was doing so that he could drive it the way he wanted to. That was the impression I had.
Great to hear that. No surprise to hear any of that, really. And I, my watching Kimi, he was always absolutely brilliant in terms of his power application and knowing exactly the right moment and the rate at which to get power into the loaded rear.
Yeah.
Zavej Dougal, another of our members. Thank you very much, Zavej. Hi, Mark. Question for you since your time at Haas. Why do you think they've not made the step to being regular point scorers in 10 years? I mean, they're not doing too badly, are they? And do you think Toyota can make them a championship contender? And if I can throw on another question at the back of that one, in Mark, how they got away for so long in not building their own car?
Um, yeah, I think they certainly this year and last year, and even the year before as well. I think they definitely have made progress towards becoming regular point scorers, and I would argue that they're actually putting some of the other teams to shame. I mean, Williams being the obvious candidate, and this year obviously Aston Martin, because Haas are a tiny little team. I mean, I don't think people appreciate just how small that team is compared to the others, and that's because they buy in the complete drivetrain and the front and rear suspension, including steering. What Haas have to provide by regulation is all of the wetted aerodynamic surfaces, including the chassis. So the chassis is completely a Haas design, as are the front and rear wings, the bodywork, the floor. Sorry, one thing I should say is they do brake ducts as well. So the Haas brake ducts are theirs. But that gives them an efficiency and a focus that other teams struggle to achieve, I would say. Managing a large organisation is one of the most difficult bits of Formula One now. And we're talking about the teams alone being around 1,000 people. So managing that is not easy. So Haas managing, I'm going to say, I'm not sure what the current numbers are, but I would say 300 to 400 tops. That's a much more efficient organisation to manage. So people's goals tend to be more readily obvious. The downside they have is they work across a number of sites. They have Alora making parts. They have design people in Alora. They have a design office at Ferrari. And obviously they have the Toyota connection as well. They're using some Toyota facilities in Cologne, I'd imagine. So that is a difficult thing to manage. They're using the Ferrari wind tunnel, so they haven't got access to a wind tunnel in the UK. They haven't got a simulator in the UK at the moment. They have use of Ferrari's sort of backup simulator, but my experience of that was that it was very hard to make use of effectively, because the tools that Ferrari use to run their simulator are not the tools that the teams have from their own use. So Atlas and simulation software are different. So it's very difficult to use the Ferrari simulator. So I think they do a pretty remarkably good job with all that. What they are subject to is basically the competitiveness of Ferrari to some extent, because if the Ferrari engine or drivetrain in a year has a poor performance, then Haas are going to suffer from that. And then the other thing is, because they're doing their own aero, if the Ferrari suspension isn't in tune with the Haas aero, they've got a big problem. That certainly was a problem in 2023 when the Ferrari aero behavior and the Haas aero behavior were quite different. The Ferrari picked up huge amounts of downforce at low ride heights at the rear, and the Haas didn't. So that meant the Ferrari ran a much stiffer suspension setup to get their rear ride height low, because they benefited from that. But we had the same equipment in terms of suspension setup equipment, and we couldn't run the car soft enough to suit our aero. And the trouble is, Haas don't know what Ferrari aero is going to be for the year ahead. They don't have access to that information, quite rightly. So they're kind of playing a bit of a guessing game going into the season. And that year we came completely unstuck, because the car just didn't behave in the way that the suspension we were provided with forced us to run the car. For 2024, that changed dramatically. And the suspension layout that we had available, particularly at the rear of the car, allowed us to run the car softer, because there was more suspension travel available and more components that allowed us to have sort of more useful steps in stiffness. And all of a sudden, we weren't killing the rear tyres anymore, because we could run our car softer the way we wanted to. So yeah, it's a difficult situation, but I think so Haas have have different things to deal with than the other teams, but they're still difficulties. But I think the thing they do have is a focus. I think it helps to be a smaller organisation. The other thing that I would say is that that cost of the things that they get from Ferrari is very high. They spend an awful lot of money at Ferrari and at Alora. So it's not like they're getting things on the cheap or anything like that. And it's a significant drain on their budget. And their budget is not as big as the other teams, from my experience, although nominally they may have reached the budget cap a couple of years ago. It's known within the business that there are teams that have ways of spending money in areas that are useful that don't come within the cap, through outside companies that are associated with them, and that's something that the big teams wanted, because when the cap was introduced, obviously the big teams stood to lose compared to the small teams. So the way it was done was that there were certain allowances made whereby the big teams could effectively spend more money by having outside help, shall we say, not overtly, but by various clever means that were monitored, but you had to stay within the rules. But it does mean that the bigger teams tend to be able to spend more money than the smaller teams, even though there's a cost cap. So, and that still has an impact.
Good. Thanks for all that, Mark. I mean, the only other question, of course, is the future with Toyota and whether or not we think,
well,
maybe they will go. Knowing the way Toyota seem to love motorsport, they're doing so much for young drivers, and we see Maurizio buying a super formula team just to keep it going, and he might well say, right, let's do some engines and let's go with Haas.
I think obviously when the Toyota connection was established, Ferrari were extremely worried about that and about the crossover, the fact that they might get screwed over basically by Toyota learning things. So as I understand it, there was quite an extreme demarcation of areas that Toyota had access to. And I think the amount of the requirement for Haas was to have some simulator capability and manufacturing capability that they didn't at the time have access to. So it was more that Haas were going to have access to facilities that they could use within Toyota than that Toyota would be able to get involved in the design and manufacture, or certainly the design and development of the car itself. Yes, young driver development, I think, was a big part of the relationship that Toyota were keen on. But I think that's been one of the difficult areas. And I do wonder if maybe the Toyota side of things hasn't developed to the extent that maybe Haas would have liked. I'm not sure, because of the restrictions that Ferrari have imposed on them. How far it goes in the future, it's a good question. I mean, I certainly get the impression that Toyota are very keen to progress in that area. I think there's been a bit of a change of management at Toyota a few years ago, and the new management are really keen to get involved, which I think is extremely positive. I think there's a feeling that the Toyota F1 involvement of should we say, the 2000s was somewhat mishandled. And I think that the current people in charge at Toyota think that there's a wrong to be written, shall we say, or a wrong to be righted, and that they want to get involved and show what they can do. And I think Toyota is an organisation that everyone should be somewhat concerned about, because they have phenomenal capability, as has been shown in WEC. And I think people might argue that balance of performance has been used against Toyota to some extent over the last few years, because they are such a potential threat. It'll be interesting to see going forward how much involvement they have.
Phenomenal in rallying too, and I'm also thinking that the problems that Honda are currently having actually will be a spur for Toyota, because if they can come into Formula One and do a pretty good job almost out of the box, which they probably will, that'll look good for them as well. I mean, you could say, well, you know, Honda having so many problems, maybe that will scare Toyota away. I mean, that's another way. I don't think it'll work that way. I think Toyota will react to this, and it'll be a positive for them, knowing the way they are at the moment. As you say, there's a lot of enthusiasm there for motorsport. Jim Hontz, who's a member, and we had his comments up right at the beginning again. Thanks, Jim. Adds now, says, hi, Peter, and says pretty bluntly, I got to say, until Formula One gets back to allowing drivers to be drivers rather than energy harvesters, the sport is going in the wrong direction. Well, I'm sure you're not the only person on the planet that thinks that, Jim. I kind of agree with you, to be honest. So there you go. Thank you for saying that. Drew says, Peter, Mark, how big a difference can Adrian make if Fernando says the team chef can drive the car, obviously saying that cynically. So with that logic, Gordon Ramsay can drive the best Formula One car, according to Alonso. So isn't Adrian's skill being belittled there? Well, yeah, quite a complex. Well, we'll do your next question. Stefano Domenicali is talking to BYD for doing a full electric Chinese car company about Formula One. Zoe must be happy. I'm not. What do you think about full electric car companies in Formula One? Well, let's deal with that question, Mark. What do you reckon? I mean, I was only saying to somebody last night in a conversation, why they were saying, why has Formula One gone electric at all? Why did they change something that was really brilliant and let electrics be covered by all the other forms of motorsport, which I kind of agree with. But here we are saying now, potentially, they're going to have a full electric Formula One challenge, Formula One regulation. What do you think, Mark?
I can't say that I'm a fan on the basis of I think the noise is part of the spectacle, a part of the excitement.
Hang on. Build your dreams, BYD. I'm sure they'll be able to come up with mega sound, artificial sound. That's what building your dream is all about, isn't it? Yeah. I'm being facetious here.
Yeah, I know, and it's just totally soulless, isn't it?
Yeah.
That for me,
I can't help thinking of your dad and the Vulcan and the noise that thing made.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. Those Olympus engines were not known for their quietness, were they? Yeah. I think this is where Formula One's commercialization is somewhat inevitable, but I think it doesn't lead to something that I'm necessarily going to be interested in. I mean, the Chinese have gone heavily into electric cars while the rest of the world is sort of backpedaling. And I think that could be to our detriment economically at some point in the future. And I guess what Formula One see is a huge amount of cash available in China that they want to get their hands on, to put it bluntly. But for me, as a fan of racing, that's not something I want to see. I don't want silent cars or cars with artificial sound going round. And I think to try and have the existing teams with ICE engines and some electric assistance racing against a full electric car, if that's what's being talked about, I don't see any way you can actually balance those things out, unless you bring in balance of performance, I suppose, is the way you go about it, like they do in WEC. But personally, I think there are big problems with that. As a fan, it might be okay for, shall we say, people who just want to see cars going fast and making a noise, and even if it's artificial. But I think it detracts from the inherent integrity of the sport myself. It's not something I want to see, but I can understand why they're going down that route purely from the commercial aspect. But isn't that what Formula E is supposed to be? Why don't they just big up Formula E and have that, like you said in the past, as a support series for Formula One? I don't want to see Formula One going down that route.
I think Stefan Rattel must be rubbing his hands with glee at the moment. He's thinking about a GT3 now, which potentially could have, I don't know, Max Verstappen, Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, maybe Lando, I'm sure, will be in there. Guys like Oliver Berman, for sure. GT3, bring it on, the new future.
Yeah, but they're all going to go down the money route in the end, aren't they?
Well,
You
are
know,
they though? I'm not sure they are. I think that, if it did go to electric cars, I think there was a point where guys like Charles and Max say, right, we've got enough money already. We're going to go motor racing. This is crazy. Or indeed, there will be a breakaway championship at that point, I think.
interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do we get to the point where it actually becomes commercially worthwhile to have an ICE championship?
Yeah.
A combustion engine championship that attracts people because of what it is.
Yeah.
That's we're testing those limits now, aren't we? And I think this start of this year was quite a negative impact on Formula One. I know Stefano Domenicali has said there's no problem with Formula One. If there's no problem with Formula One, then I don't really understand why these changes have been made coming into this race weekend, because you only make changes if there's a problem. But I guess he's trying to talk it up. But I think they got to be very, very careful. And I think expanding into new markets, as Formula One has done over the last few years, particularly in America, they've got to be really careful about what they're trying to sell. If anything, I would say there's probably more openness to technological innovation through electrical power and other things in Europe than there might be in the States. I might be wrong in that, but US sport or US motor racing doesn't have a history of technical innovation, because I think the fans and the people who pay the money want to see action and spectacle. And there's some validity in that. I thoroughly enjoy IndyCar racing myself. So I think Formula One has to be very careful which route it takes, and not just be seeing dollar signs. And I think you covered it in the last time we talked. We're starting to see a bigger influence of commercial considerations actually shaping the sport than we did in the past. And I'm not a fan of that. I think the priority should be to come up with a racing spectacle that people love, and then the money will come in because it's something that people want to be part of. But as soon as those people start trying to shape it to their own ends, you're in great danger, I think, real risk territory.
Yeah, and again, you've made this point that when a couple of years ago, the discussion about front axle generation and or MGUH was raised, a number of teams expressed their concerns about getting rid of it. And yet, obviously, they gave in the end to the commercial consideration of, well, you're going to make more money because Audi will come in and the sport will grow. And that is actually the tipping point. The tipping point is whether the teams will ever get to a situation where they say, no, we won't accept that, and we're not going to agree to that. And the teams haven't done that collectively yet, but it'll be interesting to see how this develops from here on in.
The teams are trusting F1 Liberty to deliver the goods financially to them, and so they're happy to go along with things. And if F1 and Liberty and the FIA are sensible, they'll listen to the teams who do have pretty good understanding of things, and between them come up with something that works. But there was evidence coming into this set of rules that balance was getting out of hand. But then vested interests are always a difficult thing to work with, aren't they? Because I think there is a danger when you listen to the teams. The people who are on the other side, in the FIA and F1, will be worried that those teams are trying to gain an advantage, because that is the nature of Formula One, and sure, that will have been done to some extent. But I think my understanding of what the discussions that we had a few years back are that the teams were genuinely saying, or there were people in the teams genuinely saying, you've got to be careful with what you're proposing, because it will lead to things that may not be attractive, and those people were not listened to. So it's a difficult thing. I hope that common sense comes through, but I am worried that we're seeing a push towards commercialization leading Formula One in a negative direction. On the other hand, I think these changes for this weekend, I do think they do put the drivers back in charge to a greater extent, so a much greater extent than they were. So I think that answers some of the criticisms that were made. The drivers will not be doing as much energy recovery as they were, particularly in qualifying, and I think that's a good thing. Maybe a bigger step would be ideal, but I think that would have downsides. We've already discussed a little bit in terms of car design and the competitiveness of the people who've done a good job, which, all credit to them for doing so. So these are all considerations, but I just hope that this experience is used to determine the future, and not just ignored.
Yeah, and I still think we need to look back at the past as well in order to understand the future. And of course, the past is related to Bernie Ecclestone, and it is related to his sale of Formula One's commercial rights in the year 2000, and then beyond. Obviously, it changed hands soon after that, Leo Kirsch. But Bernie made pretty sure that he still ran Formula One in an autocratic way with his mate Max. And that was why it worked, even though he'd sold those commercial rights. And we're not in that situation anymore. And that's where it's a different world now. That is the point, I think. And, and we don't have a Bernie Max situation anymore. Right, Ronnie Way, another supporter member. Thank you so much, Ronnie. Hi, Peter and Mark. We fear the day AI will be used to manage the car and overriding the driver's natural instincts. I agree with Nigel Mansell's comments that the lift and coast used now is very different from the feathering of the throttle of the previous eras. It's artificial. Thanks. Is that right? They did lift and coast. I think we did, but it wasn't to the extent that we do it today, right?
Lift and coast has been a factor for a long time. I would say more in the racing in IndyCar in the States. It was because those cars tended to be fuel limited because of the way they do fueling pit stops. That was something that was more known to them, and I think the benefits of lift and coast in terms of tyre management and car balance are something that's been learned in the last sort of 10 years or so, and it's something that won't go away, because once you've learned something that's beneficial, it's just going to be there. The reason it's become a bigger factor is because of the energy recovery. So lift and coast, because of the way the rules are written, has been the most efficient way of recovering energy or extra energy in addition to what you get through braking. They've rebalanced the rules for this coming race to make the super clipping more efficient, which means that the drivers will be doing a bit less lift and coast. And also the energy recovery level is less, so that you will lose lap time unnecessarily if you do too much lift and coast now. But it's just something that is a fact. You can't unlearn new things that are good, and it makes the car go quicker, particularly in a race, to do some lift and coast. This even without the energy considerations.
Aaron says, should Formula One test changes to technical regulations in the likes of Formula 2 before they're fully implemented in Formula One? Well, it's a nice idea, Aaron, but how would that happen? Who would pay for the development of them in Formula 2? The F1 teams wouldn't want to do that, I wouldn't have thought. I can't imagine the FIA would. It makes sense to treat it a bit like the development of Pirelli tyres, but it's not as simple as that. I think you'd agree with that, Mark?
Yeah, and in fact, the way to develop these things is through gaming.
Yeah.
That's where you could do it. You could have something set up with access the teams have, and they could be doing their own racing behind the scenes, developing new formulas. So that would be the way to do it. Related to that point, I actually think there is now a big problem with drivers coming through and engineers coming through from the junior formula, more particularly the drivers, because now Formula One is so distinctly different from every other racing category. A driver coming from F2 into F1, it's a whole nother world. It's a huge step. And that's why we're seeing drivers hanging on.
If I can interject, that's a huge step in terms of all the technical requirements of what you've got to do. I wouldn't have said it's a massively huge step in terms of the classic racing driver's skill of, let's say Formula 2 was I don't know, 300 horsepower, and Formula One was 1500 horsepower. That's when you could say there's a huge step. But when the step, you may disagree with this, but when the step is about all the use of regeneration, how to manage the car technically, that's a lot of stuff. A lot of these young kids are very bright, very computer savvy. A lot of that can be learned in a very good sim, providing the team's got a good sim. And then you're almost more stage managed in terms of how you drive the lap now than you've ever been before. And I would actually say that you could be a pretty average Grand Prix driver in the sense of the history of the sport, comparing yourself with whoever you want to compare yourself. You know, you're mid-range, you're not that good, but you're not bad. You can score the odd podium maybe. But if you're at a very good team now and you do a massive amount of work in the simulator and you've got a very good brain that's very systematic, you can actually do pretty well now, much better than you could have in, say, 1987.
I think that's true, but it's a very different mental and physical approach, isn't it, than we've had in the past.
That's the sad thing.
It's a different generation of people. But the reason I think it is a factor is it's why we get some of the drivers hanging around for longer. That the cars are less physical to drive than maybe they were 15, 20, 30 years ago, but also the older drivers have a better understanding of the car racing side of things and have a bit more room to accommodate. So I suppose it comes down to brain power. I say we are getting into an era where the drivers have to be smarter. That's for sure. It's not just driving a car that is the thing anymore. It never really was it? But it's putting more emphasis on mental capability than I think we used to have.
Today's racing driver needs to be capable of flying a helicopter or indeed a Vulcan bomber.
Yes, quite possibly.
Yeah. Mario, this is a sad one. For the first time in my life since 1984, I want to miss a Formula One race, especially after listening to Domenicali. Well, I'm sad to hear that.
Yeah.
Sema Dragon,
I think you should give it a go.
3 fires. What's that, Mark?
I think you should give it a go. I honestly, I think these changes that they brought in will help. I think it will be better.
Yeah. It's Daniel Brodsky echoes that. I haven't been waiting for Miami. It's so sad. Okay. Sachin Seshadri. Hi, Peter and Mark. Why did Ferrari never build the team around Charles Leclerc 16 like Red Bull did with Max? It feels like they love him like a son, give him bumper contracts, but don't trust him as a number one driver. My thoughts on that are that in the time that Charles has been at Ferrari, there have been 3 team principals. And I think it's quite political there, isn't it? And if you didn't hire this driver, then he's not your driver, sort of thing. So I think Charles went through a bit of that. And then they, because when Carlos Sainz arrived, he was pretty much the golden boy for a while. And that was okay. I mean, Seb Vettel felt the same thing. He felt isolated after a while, didn't he? And but we've talked about it, haven't we? They had a good team. They had Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, who'd found his place. He'd found his sweet spot. He was doing a really good job. Charles still was the man. If there was going to be a championship out there to be won by Ferrari, if the car was good enough. And yet they blew it all apart by getting rid of Carlos and hiring Lewis when they didn't really need Lewis. No offense to Lewis now, and he did exactly the right thing to take the offer, in my opinion. But the reality is they didn't need Lewis. They could have kept these 2 drivers and be doing just the same job that they are. And that was just poor judgment by Ferrari, poor management, in my opinion. And it all came from, outside the running of the team, I think. And it's a great shame. So politically, I think Ferrari are still suffering from that. And had they not changed the driver team, they would be okay. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Mark?
Pretty much the same. I think it's the political machinations of Ferrari that make it less successful than it could be. I mean, if you look at the periods when Ferrari has been super successful, so let's say with Niki Lauda in the mid-70s, I think Montezemolo was the man in charge with Forghieri. And it was a very defined structure that they had with a very singular focus on winning. And Nicky's sort of capabilities mentally, as well as his ability to drive the car, were a big factor in that. And so you had a very successful team. Then I think the leftovers of that kind of took them into even, say, 79's championship with Jody Scheckter. I mean, they had a great engine, and it was a time of turmoil in Formula One, aero things coming in. I think there were teams that didn't understand their cars. Certainly with the first Grand Prix cars, people put wings on them on the sideboards, but didn't understand the cars needed to be stiff. So even Colin Chapman didn't understand that. So it was a time when the competition wasn't that strong. As soon as people started to get their act together, beyond 1979, Ferrari kind of drifted away. They came back in the late 90s because they had Ross Brawn, Michael Schumacher, and Jean Todt. And that, again, was a very singularly minded, dynamic leadership team that didn't let other people deflect them. And then when that dissolved, as inevitably things do after time, they're back into that sort of committee working type of environment. And no one has the authority. No one who knows what they're doing has enough authority to insist on things being done in a particular way. And I don't think Charles is that sort of driver. He's not a Michael Schumacher. He's not a Niki Lauda. He doesn't have that mental strength to get involved in the way the team should be managed, in the way those two drivers did, or have, for instance, a support team pushing as well as maybe Max does with Jos. So I think these are all factors. It's actually what makes Formula One interesting to me. It's not just about having the best car, the best driver. It's all these interactions. And Ferrari's biggest problem has always been, how do you pull everything together? How do you get everyone pulling in the same direction? And I, even when I was at Haas and we had Ferrari's input in terms of the parts of the car, you could see that it wasn't the refined process or that it should be. We got offered parts, developments, and we would look at it and go, what the hell's that for? Why have they done that? That's not something that we should want. And it just indicated to me that there were people, just too many people with some authority to get things done, but not being directed in an efficient manner. And I think that Red Bull, most recently, McLaren coming through now, they're just teams that have a more singular focus. And going back to Haas, I think that's the thing, that with only having 350, 400 people, whatever they have now, it's easier to focus people with a smaller number of people. When you've got a lot of people, it's harder to do that. And that's why I'm always very impressed when teams manage to get to the front and stay there. It's incredibly difficult to achieve.
Yep, agreed 100%. Next one, Mark, an interesting point this, and it's not the first time it's been raised either. JPS 78 MA, great name. Hi, Peter, Mark. What are your thoughts on the teams blocking the views to their cars in the garage on race weekends? Don't the other teams already know what their competitors have, bearing in mind they have to expose them on Thursday anyway? And aren't they only hurting the fans, therefore, in doing that? It's a good point, isn't it? I mean, I find it very annoying. You see Williams, they stop out on the circuit, they bring the car back in, and immediately they sort of have all their mechanics standing at the front of the garage so nobody can see the work that's going on. I mean, what is that all about? Is anybody really going to copy anything on a Williams, for a start? And secondly, as JPS 78 says, the fans want to see all this stuff.
Well, the fact is, I know for a fact that the teams employ photographers to take very detailed pictures of the other team's cars, and it can be extremely useful. So, development is very expensive, costs a lot of time, and if another team has a great idea and there's something on their car that is really a new thing that's useful, every other team wants that thing. And the quickest way to get it is by copying someone else. So I don't think we should underestimate the power of that. It isn't actually very easy to see what other teams are doing with their cars. Getting at that detail is quite tricky because of the covers and everything. And when the cars are presented outside in the pit lane on a Friday morning, they've got the bodywork on, so you can't necessarily see what's underneath. So I understand why it happens. It is definitely negative for the spectators. I used to love it when in Autosport they used to put the new cars would be shown in January, February with bodywork off, and there'd be detailed analysis of the new parts and the developments, and that would be fascinating. But the reality is that you can lose a competitive edge if you let people see what you're doing. It's quite important. I know Adrian Newey was always very unhappy if any elements of the car were seen in public before they went unnecessarily. So I understand it from the team's point of view, and I understand it from the spectators' point of view as well. And basically, it's up to the FIA and F1 to force teams to show stuff, which is why once the weekends start, you're not allowed to put banners in front of the garage. And so you have groups of mechanics standing in front of the cars instead.
Yeah.
So I think it's perfectly understandable. If you've spent the amount of money that the teams are on developing your car, you don't want to be giving that information away for free.
And I suppose you could always argue, as some would, that it adds to the mystique that we have all that security, and that's part of Formula One's magic. I don't know.
I would love to see more reports under the bodywork of those cars, but the only way that's going to happen is if the teams are forced to do it. And I think that's understandable. If I was spending that money, as I said, I wouldn't want someone to see my new development, because I know they're going to be straight on it the following day, looking into why a team's done that. Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, next question. This is Racer Ray. Says, "Hi Peter, I took a screenshot of you with Carlos Reutemann on the grid in Austria 81. What a season he had. But Murray Walker described you as a journalist. Weren't you with Williams then?" No, I was a journalist. Murray was absolutely correct. I started being a sort of semi-journalist, if you like, in 1978 when I was sports editor of Autocar, a full-time job. But that was when I had lunch with Frank at the Steering Wheel Club, and he asked me to help him develop the sponsorship of his new rebooted team in the Middle East. And in those days, it was Saudi Arabian Airlines, TAG, and so forth, Al Bilad, and I started working for Frank in my spare time, doing all of that. And simultaneously, that's when I met Nigel, and I already knew Carlos by then, of course. And so I was kind of multitasking a lot and doing my full-time job as a journalist and writing and going to all the races, but simultaneously basically trying to help Nigel as much as possible get into Formula One from Formula 3, which we did from 78 onwards. And then Carlos. Yeah, I mean, I started working with Carlos in 76 when he said, "Look, I want to get out of this ridiculous Brabham Alpha situation. I want to go to Ferrari. Can you?" And I started basically doing a lot of work with Bernie and Carlos on that, and doing a lot of behind the scenes stuff with him. And I was very close to Carlos thereafter and helped him get the Williams drive. So yeah, in 81, I was with him every race, and Nigel for that matter. And so, but I was actually still writing for Autocar in those days. They were heady days. Yeah, good. Stefan Jasimovic. NASA abandoned the space shuttle because it didn't make sense to focus on reusability if you're going to explore space. Okay. Does it make sense to chase the same if you're in the pinnacle of racing, i.e. Formula One? It's an interesting point. Is that exact? I don't really know. Is that exactly why they did stop the shuttle program? Because they thought that reusability was not the future? Is that right, Mark? Do you think?
I understood that the shuttle program got heavily compromised by the need to allow military capability in terms of the thing. It ended up being a lot bigger, didn't it, than it was originally intended to be, because the funding was partly from military, and the military wanted bigger things putting in space than NASA originally intended. And I think I got the impression that it was that size issue compromised the design, and then simply the disasters they had was such a negative impact that I think the government, the US government, didn't want to be funding something that was obviously so dangerous. That was a negative thing, and NASA made too many mistakes. So I think, and I think the government was getting earwigged by people with money who wanted to do it privately and saw that that was a way of making a large amount of money, because they obviously saw the amount of money that NASA was getting and wanted to get their hands on it. So I think there was a number of factors there. But I thought the original space shuttle design was compromised very heavily, and that made it a somewhat unwieldy and less efficient package than it was meant to be. And it wasn't the design that NASA actually wanted it to be, unfortunately. SpaceX is about reusable boosters. They're landing on platforms in the sea. I mean, that you couldn't get more reusable than what SpaceX are trying to do. So I don't think it's anything to do with the reusability. I think it's just the design that they came up with was heavily compromised, and the cost of redoing it was something that no one wanted to contemplate without private involvement.
And SpaceX, as I understand it, using carbon landing gear created by All American Racers, Dan Gurney's company. Yeah, so there's your link. But the other point, I think, just showing my age here, but going back to the Apollo program and being a kid, who was super impressionable the day, well, not even the day Neil Armstrong put a foot on the moon, but well before that, even, when Ed White did the first spacewalk and things like that, wonderful things that were going on, and how quickly that program expanded, and the things they achieved in a decade were just incredible, and it drove that whole period of the 60s. But the undercurrent to that, being raised in Australia, was the Vietnam War. And by the early 70s, usual thing, the public had got a bit bored about landing on the moon. Yeah, been there, done that, even though there was Dave White driving the moon rover and doing all these great things. And NASA, I think, went into, it's not panic mode, but I think NASA's response to all that was, well, we got to do something, and everybody's complaining about all the money we're wasting now and we're not achieving anything. Who's ever going to live on the moon? We'll come up with some reusable thing so it looks really, like something that is the future. And then Skylab was developed, and then the shuttle as a result of that. And I think it was all, my opinion, my view, they should never have stopped the Apollo program. We'd be in Mars by now. I don't know where we'd be. And they should never have stopped it. And it was stopped all because of the media and the whole thing about, all the unrest about in the world, and all the money we're wasting on the Apollo program we'll put into saving the planet. Yeah, well, that worked well, didn't it? And of course, that was all human stuff. And that's why it was kind of a wrong turning. And that's why eventually the whole thing ground to a halt, because when you take a wrong turning, things do eventually grind to a halt. And I wonder if that'll happen in Formula One. That's the question. I mean, they've gone the route they've taken now, not because of the excesses and the public reaction to what was the old Formula One. They've done it because they think that's the future and that's where the money is. And so it's a different reason, but it may not well be the right reason either way. It's an interesting subject, that, isn't it? An enormous subject. And then continuing from that, gentleman, what is the connection between NASA and Formula One throughout history? Could their mechanics contribute to Formula One? Well, so many contributions, and I'm sure Mark will add some, but just off the top of my head, Nomex obviously was one, and that, I don't know how many drivers' injuries have been saved by the use of Nomex in Formula One. And then obviously Hercules would not have been the company it was if it wasn't for NASA. And Hercules effectively gave us carbon chassis in Formula One. And how many lives and injuries have carbon chassis saved since 1981? Yeah, it's a lot. So there's two. There are many more, and then in my experience, it's the old thing. It's like talking to Mark about his dad and the interrelation between that and Formula One, and how much his dad for sure loved Mark's life in Formula One. Same thing, a lot of astronauts, a lot of the Apollo astronauts used to come to Grand Prix races, and what a great thing that was. And then you've got all the Formula One drivers. I mean, Colin Chapman leaving the Brazilian Grand Prix when the Lotus 88 is in trouble. He leaves it on Saturday night. Why? To go and watch the space shuttle launch in Florida. Actually, it was delayed and he didn't get to see it, but nonetheless, you can see where I'm coming from. But Mark, I'm sure you've got some good. And Bob Bell actually is another guy, another good engineer who very into Boeing and very into NASA as well, and understanding of it. But I'm sure you've got your own history as well.
I think it's. I'm not sure of specific. I think mainly it's material science. I think is the big thing. I think there's been a huge input into motor racing has made use of a lot of the advances made in materials, particularly so inside the engines, the gearboxes, the chassis, as you already mentioned. It's the appliance of science, isn't it? In many ways, I think in the 60s, NASA represented the more obvious peak of scientific achievement. And I think motor racing has developed down a much more scientific path from a sort of slightly, garage amateurish initially in the, say, immediate post-war period. It's inevitable that people started to use the technologies from the aerospace industries in the cars, and then as money's come in, that's just grown and grown, and that was certainly the aspect that attracted me to it. When I got interested in Formula One, it was the late 70s, when the cars were really changing radically, mainly due to aerodynamic influences, but there were other aspects as well that I think people were really starting to understand how science could be used to make cars go more quickly. And that was incredibly appealing to me as a youngster, and why I wanted to get into it, really, in addition to the competition and all that side of it. In some ways, I think that's partly a problem with where we are now, in that understanding how batteries work and things like that, it's a little bit more obtuse. It's not so obvious in terms of technology. I mean, I know it is fantastic technology that is being used. The NGUH was something that actually was a huge technical step forwards, but has now gone for commercial reasons. So that there are still technological advances being made, but they're somewhat obtuse, somewhat clouded. And at the same time, the more and more rules that are brought into Formula One, the more restricted the technological advancement is. And the cars end up being forced to be the same, and people can't make changes. Things like, even in my time, things like the inerter that was brought in to the suspension after the sort of moving masses of the Renault in 2005, when inerters came in, that was actually a big step forward in terms of car grip, and it was an advancement from science. But that got banned, and I just think it's a bit of a shame, because the cars inherently, the technology isn't actually moving forwards in the way that it did in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, apart from in that area of battery technology and, shall we say, electronics. I mean, even your basic road car has stability control that a Formula One car isn't allowed to have on it. So yeah, it's just a different time, and I suspect that if I was the 11-year-old looking at Formula One now, I wouldn't find it as appealing as I did in 1978, when things were obviously changing at quite a dramatic rate. But certainly science, I think the boundaries of science were advanced enormously by the space program, in a way that probably wasn't even foreseen by the people who started it. And when you start to restrict things, as happened in the sort of, as you say, through the late 70s, through the 80s, the sort of expected positives coming out of those programs start to reduce, don't they? Because you're not putting as much new thought into things.
Yeah, absolutely right. And in terms of history, though, I think one of the most colourful and obvious examples of the relationship between NASA and Formula One, but certainly motor racing, was Jim Rathman, who won the '58 Race of Two Worlds at Monza, which was that amazing event when IndyCar drivers came over with their cars to Monza and raced on the banking at Monza, the wrong way round, anti-clockwise, ridiculously high speeds. And Jim Rathman won that in '58. You can imagine what it was like driving an Indy Roadster on the bumpy banking at Monza. And he won that in '58. He won the '60 Indy 500. So he's a serious driver. And but he had a Chevy dealership. That was his real life. He had a Chevy dealership in Cape Canaveral, very near Cape Canaveral. And when the whole Apollo thing started, not only Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and the original 5, 7, and then obviously then going forward, he used to give each of them a Chevy Corvette to play around with in their time when they were there. You can imagine what that was like for those guys. I mean, just brilliant. Those sorts of things don't happen anymore, I don't think, do they, Mark? Not things like that, really. Your dad would appreciate that, I imagine.
Wish I'd had a Corvette to play with. That would have been great.
Yeah. I fell in love with Corvettes in, it must have been 72, 73. Pete Lyons, a fabulous American journalist. I think up there with Nigel Roebuck and, well, Dennis Jenkinson, Henry Manny. Okay, there are a lot. But Pete Lyons, beautiful writer and still writing today, and incredible reports he used to write for Autosport. American, but he had this red Corvette, the one with the long nose, and he used to drive it around Europe from race to race, and I absolutely fell in love with that car. I never even sat in it, but I used to watch Pete getting in it every night and driving out of the press car park, very envious, thinking one day when I grow up I want to have a Corvette. Never happened. Still time, I suppose. So here we go. Right. We can't hear Mark when you switch to yourself, Peter. No, that's right. You can't. I don't have Mark's mic on there for obvious reasons. So, KBNDZ. Instead of sprint races, Formula One should have the reserve drivers race different spec cars. Hypercars GT3. Well, yeah, but the sprint races aren't there for the young drivers, though, are they? So what's the relationship? I don't quite get that one. Yeah, your thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, they're reserve drivers in case one of the regular drivers can't race the car.
Yeah.
As we had with Kev Magnussen when he was ill in Brazil back in 2024. So yeah, it's not really compatible, is it? And you're right, the junior driver, the reserve drivers don't do the sprint race. So one thing I do think is that the reserve drivers don't do enough racing when they're reserve drivers. That's a problem, which is, I guess, somewhat resolved by doing that. A lot of these guys do take part in simulator racing, even if they don't make it public. Certainly when Lewis was driving for McLaren in 2007, 2008, he spent a lot of time doing racing online that people didn't know about because he didn't race under his own name. And Heikki used to do it as well. They used to race against each other. So half the talking between the two was about how they got on against each other in the simulator racing they'd been doing. But I do think it would be, if you could get the reserve drivers racing somehow, it would be good. But they can't do it at the same time as the race events, because that makes them not reserve drivers. That makes them full-time drivers. So it's a tricky one. I think it comes to Formula 2, doesn't it? Formula 2 was more of a junior Formula 1 than it currently is, because it is so different. Maybe the reserve drivers would be in it in the same way that, Jim Clark and Graham Hill and Carlos Reutemann used to race in Formula 2 at the same time as they were racing in Formula 1. But obviously there's a danger aspect for the teams in that.
Yeah, I mean, the danger aspect is another subject altogether, but I mean, they need to come back to my proposal, which will never happen, which is that they should have a second championship below Formula One, between Formula Two and Formula One, which is basically last year's Formula One cars within reason, whatever cars they would test now if they're doing a demo in a city, supported by the Formula One teams. But it's an independent championship with its own TV rights, its own circuits, its own administration, and it's a proper B division Formula One. And it's at the tracks in the countries that want to come into Formula One, but don't yet have the full support of the government or whatever they need. But nonetheless, they're countries that Formula One wants to encourage, like India, South Africa, several South American nations, Asian countries. And it's a separate championship. And that would be a great thing then, because there are too many great drivers and not enough racing and opportunities to drive. But as I say, that'll never happen because everyone would think that would detract from Formula One. So it never will, sadly. Right. Move on to the next one, which is let me have a look at our box here. Actually, we're getting pretty near the witching hour, I think, because we've been going a long time. I think we've been overusing our time with Mark as well. So I know, again, folks, we haven't got through everybody, and I feel bad about that, but we'll keep going. And just a quick reminder that we're going to be doing the normal 3 videos from the Miami Grand Prix this weekend on Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights, European time. But in addition, on Sunday, starting just before the race and during the race, I'm going to be doing a live stream as well, really to interact with your questions and comments while the race is going on, which won't be a watch along in the sort of sense that others do it. It'll be, oh, that's interesting. Oh, what's happening there? And you can make whatever comments you want to me. So watch out for that. That is for members only, and very easy to join as a channel member. You just click that join button below our videos, and I hope you do so, because this will be the first of many we'll be doing like that. And for me, it's going to be fun. It's going to be a lot of fun interacting with you guys, because again, a big thanks to all of you, because without your questions, I mean, the scope of the questions and how broad they've been, particularly today, I think more than any other live stream we've had, is just astonishing. And Mark and I were talking about this before the show. You know, it's getting to people like yourselves who really want to delve deep and understand what our sport is all about, that makes this show what it is. So I've got you back on the screen now, Mark, just to thank you so much for your input, and to say, let's hang around on Sunday. You know, I'm not convinced that I'm going to be capable of bringing you in live into the show, because there'll be a lot going on with me watching all the other screens and stuff. But if you can be there on WhatsApp, that'll be brilliant.
Yep,
during the race
absolutely.
on Sunday to get your input, because I'm sure there'll be lots to talk about. But in the meantime, thanks so much for your time today, and looking forward to having you back on the show very, very soon. So thanks for that, and thanks to you all for being with us today. Take care. See you at the weekend.